All right, then. Hello. All right, so in this video, we're going to discover a couple of different ways to install server core versus GUI. All right, so let's get right to it. Now, Microsoft has done great things where the Windows pre-installation environment is concerned, and they refer to it as Windows PE, all right, pre-install environment. So it may surprise you to learn that the graphical 64-bit shell that guides you through the entire installation process was a novelty in Windows 2008 and then even with Windows Server 2012. So how about a quick definition? The server core installation options defining feature is that it offers as small a disk footprint as possible, which means, of course, that there's a smaller attack surface. So if you're running a server on a server core installation, these are the only supported roles: Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS, Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, ADLDS, DHCP server, DNS server, File Services, Print Services, Streaming Media Services, and Web Server, or IIS. There is no desktop in server core. So how about another quick definition? A GUI installation is the default recognizable installation process that boasts a larger disk footprint and includes a graphical user interface, or GUI. Installing via GUI provides access to more applications, but it also comes with an inherent risk, or sometimes known as bloat. Now, through the GUI installation, your attack surface, of course, is increased because there's going to be extra apps and features that you might not even ask for, but you certainly don't want. All right. So before Windows Server 2012, the options for installation methods were very limited. Although it may seem kind of outdated now. 2012? Never mind. The history of installation options is what's important to understanding how the IT career field has evolved. So understanding these options can also be important for anyone working in an organization that uses Windows Server 2012 because it's out there. Its market share is estimated to be about 39%. So that's quite a few sysadmins. Now, for those of us who have been around the IT world for, let's just say, a few years, the memory of installing Windows NT Server 4.0 is still fresh. If you're in your 20s, or maybe you've only been doing IT for a few years, just sit back and let me tell you how it was back in the day. Because it took 3 1.4 megabyte floppy disks. Yeah, Google that if you don't know what a floppy disk is. 3 1.4 megabyte floppy disks to boot the computer up and to do the initial install phase. And that was a blue screen character-based 16-bit interface. No mouse, no network, driver installation needed to be done with local media. It was only after the initial reboot that you get a bare bones GUI shell with mouse support. Bottom line here, installing the OS back in those days was a major pain. But then Microsoft went and did some really great things, especially with the advent of the Windows pre-installation environment, what we refer to as Windows PE. So starting with Windows Server 2008 and improving upon Windows PE in Windows Server 2012, we now have a graphical 64-bit shell throughout the entire installation process. It's a luxury. All right, but all joking aside, it's much less of a headache. In fact, now there are actually different approaches and options for how much of a disk footprint you want to take up and expose. So you want to talk about options, do you? See, now we have 2 installation modes. This is the choice between what was actually introduced in Windows Server 2008. The first is server core installation. Server core doesn't actually have this graphical shell and was designed to minimize the attack surface of a machine and improve its performance. 2 really great things. The second is with this GUI. So GUI installation gives you a number of apps and tools, whether you want them or not, because, well, mainly this graphical shell. So these are apps like Windows Explorer and Microsoft Management Console interface, and you get the idea. Now, Server Core is the default option, unless you override it. Your Windows Server 2012 installation is going to give you Core, but you can also switch between installation modes in Server 2012. So that approach involves dynamic interface switching, and with that, you can go back and forth between Server Core and GUI. So that gives system administrators flexibility. If you know how, you can always make your workflow look the way you want it to be. You could start with installing a server with a GUI option, then performing initial configs using your favorite tools, then switching to your Server Core to improve the performance and security of the box. So Windows Server 2012 also came with a new intermediate state called this Minimal Server Interface. So with that state, you have a GUI installation, or you could switch to the GUI and then you can strip away some of the elements, but not all. In the Minimal Server Interface, you can improve the server graphical shell, but retain access to core graphical tools like Server Manager, MMC, and a subset of the control panel options. So the bottom line here is Microsoft has given systems administrators much more flexibility in terms of how Windows is run on our networks and devices. Bravo! So what you got to do? First, you've got to get your hands on a DVD of the OS. So in our case, we use the release candidate DVD, but it's been a while since that was the default installation for Windows Server 2012. But you got to boot the computer with that installed DVD. The first screen's simple enough and pretty self-explanatory. What language should be used, the time zone, what currency do you want displayed, and what keyboard format should the system use. So as long as you've got a legit localized copy of your installation DVD, your defaults will generally be right here, all you need. Just click Next. And then the next screen is the main install screen, and it's extremely simple. So you can either install fresh or launch repair tools. In any event, press Install Now, and then that'll start the setup process. So while it's doing that, you might take a look at what's happening during the installation and see that you're in a full 64-bit graphical environment. And on top of all that, network drivers are already available, mouse drivers are installed and running already. So this is the whole shebang, right? So that's a real big change and improvement from that past in the dark ages like I told you about. Now, I did mention earlier, too, that Server Core is the default installation type for Windows Server 2012, and you should see that on the next screen. Now, if you were to click Next on that window, we would proceed into the Server Core installation. But for our purposes, we're going to override that option. Instead, we're going to select Server with a GUI, then Next. Now, you know, even way back in 2012, end-user license agreements were lengthening and getting more pervasive. You'll, of course, have to agree to this license before moving forward. So you do that, whether you speed read or just scroll and press Next. But the next screen is going to ask if this is an upgrade or a fresh installation. So admittedly, the language that gets used on the screen could be clearer because simply calling it custom doesn't adequately explain the available options, but presumably this is a fresh install, so select that and press Next. Now the next question is going to be where to install Windows. Now obviously this can go anywhere you like, but you'll probably want to choose a main system drive. Oh, and while you're here, you also have a few additional options and toggles to consider. For instance, maybe you've got a SCSI RAID array with a host bus adapter that needs a driver. Well, that can be done here. Or maybe you just want to go into Drive Options, delete the partition, and restructure your disk partitions. But, of course, the default option here is to reformat the drive that you're going to be installing the OS onto. It'll ask you before doing so if you're okay losing all the data on the drive, so go ahead and click Next, and the format should really only take a few seconds. All right, so once you've gone through these very simple steps, you're basically finished. Now, the prompts here will inform you that the computer will restart several times. It might take several minutes. It might take it might take a while. You know the routine. So the steps of this installation process are to copy Windows files to a temp folder on the target partition, get the files ready for installation, install the features, install updates, and clean it all up, and finish. But it all happens automatically. See, one nice thing about the GUI installation is that you can see down here at the bottom of the screen that there are really just 2 steps: collecting information, installing Windows. I don't know if you remember your history, but way back in Windows 98, Microsoft ran what were essentially advertisements in a banner along the screen during the installation. That was always a questionable choice, and some actually thought it was annoying and even offensive, but whatever. They've now done away with that, and what we're left with is as minimal a setup interface as you can get. Now what? So after the system reboots, you'll be taken through the orientation wizard, and first you'll be asked to assign a password to the built-in administrator account. So do that, and then confirm by clicking Finish. And it should probably go without saying, but you gotta make sure that you use a strong password that you can remember. Of course, it would not be good to forget this or misplace this particular password, but you know how to do that. So once you finish this previous step, your settings will be finalized, and it's going to be time to log in. So hopefully you remember that gosh darn password. Okay, so press Control-Alt-Delete to sign in, and upon doing so, type in the password that you've created and remembered. Next, the rest of the setup wizard runs. And then after all that's done, you'll find yourself in the traditional Windows desktop by default. Now, what's more, you'll also see that the new revamped server management tool runs. All right, well, there you go. We're going to wrap it up here. We've learned a couple of different ways to install server core versus GUI. I'm sure you got a lot out of it. Stay tuned, though. I want to see you on the other side.